It started in the middle of a broken country, where laws didn't matter anymore, and violence became normal overnight. Out of that chaos in Iraq, a group slowly formed that would go on to shock the entire world, not just because of what it did, but because it wanted everyone to see it. It goes back to the moment everything in Iraq completely broke down. In March 2003, the United States, along with its allies, invaded Iraq and quickly removed Saddam Hussein from power. But what came after was not stability. The Iraqi government collapsed almost overnight. Ministries were abandoned, prisons were opened, and huge military stockpiles were left unguarded. By May 2003, the Iraqi army had been officially disbanded by the Coalition Provisional Authority, which meant hundreds of thousands of trained soldiers suddenly had no jobs, no income, and no future. Many of them kept their weapons, and many of them were angry. In cities like Baghdad, Fallujah, and Ramadi, there was no real authority left. Police forces disappeared or stopped functioning. Criminal gangs took over neighborhoods. Kidnappings, lootings, and killings became part of daily life. Into this environment stepped Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, a Jordanian militant who had already built a reputation for being extremely violent, even before arriving in Iraq. Zarqawi had spent time in Afghanistan in the early 2000s and had formed his own small extremist network. But Iraq gave him something much bigger, an open battlefield with no rules. By late 2003 and early 2004, Zarqawi had established a group that would soon be known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, after he pledged loyalty to Osama bin Laden. But even within extremist circles, Zarqawi stood out because of how far he was willing to go. He didn't just attack US soldiers or coalition forces. He deliberately targeted Iraqi civilians, especially Shia Muslims, because he believed that triggering a sectarian war would completely destabilize the country. In August 2003, a massive truck bombing hit the United Nations headquarters in Baghdad, killing 22 people, including UN envoy Sergio Vieira de Mello. Then in March 2004, coordinated bombings during the Shia festival of Ashura killed over 180 people in cities like Karbala and Baghdad. By 2005, the violence had reached another level. Suicide bombings became almost daily events. Markets crowded with families, mosques filled with worshippers, and even funeral gatherings were targeted. One of the most shocking moments came in February 2006, when the Al-Ashqari Mosque in Samarra, one of the holiest sites for Shia Muslims, was bombed. This single attack pushed Iraq into a full-scale sectarian civil war. Sunni and Shia militias began killing each other in the streets. Entire neighborhoods were emptied as people fled or were forced out. At the height of this violence in 2006, thousands of civilians were dying every single month. Zarqawi understood that fear spreads faster than any army can move. When people are constantly scared, they stop trusting each other, they stop resisting, and society begins to collapse from the inside. He also started something new that shocked the world at the time. He used the internet to spread fear. Videos of kidnappings and executions were recorded and uploaded online. One of the most infamous cases was the beheading of American contractor Nicholas Berg in May 2004. Then in June 2006, Zarqawi's story suddenly came to an end. US intelligence tracked him down near Baquba, northeast of Baghdad, and carried out an airstrike that killed him. At the time, many leaders believed this would break the group entirely. Zarqawi had been the driving force behind much of the violence, and without him, it seemed like the organization would fall apart. But what most people didn't realize was that the system he built didn't depend on just one man anymore. The networks, the tactics, and the mindset were already in place. So, after Zarqawi's death, the group quickly adapted instead of collapsing. Later that same year, several insurgent factions came together and announced the creation of the Islamic State of Iraq, often called ISI. This was an important shift because they were no longer presenting themselves as just a terrorist group. They were claiming to be a state, even though they didn't fully control one yet. A man named Abu Ayyub al-Masri became a key leader along with Abu Omar al-Baghdadi, but their control was limited and constantly under pressure. Between 2007 and 2010, things actually turned against them. The United States increased troop levels in what became known as the Surge under General David Petraeus. At the same time, many Sunni tribes in western Iraq, especially Anbar province, turned against ISI. This movement became known as the Sunni Awakening. These tribes had initially tolerated or even supported insurgents, but they grew tired of ISI's extreme brutality, strict rules, and constant violence. They started working with U.S. forces to push the group out. By 2008, ISI had lost most of its strongholds. Many of its leaders were killed or captured. Attacks dropped significantly compared to the peak years of 2005 and 2006. For a while, it really did look like the group was finished. But beneath the surface, something was quietly rebuilding. In April 2010, a joint U.S.-Iraqi operation killed both Abu Ayyub al-Masri and Abu Omar al-Baghdadi. This could have been the final blow, but instead, it opened the door for a new leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. His real name was Ibrahim Awad Ibrahim al-Badri, and unlike Zarqawi, he had a very different personality. He had a background in Islamic studies and had reportedly been detained by U.S. forces at Camp Bucca, a detention facility in southern Iraq, where many future extremist leaders met and built connections. Baghdadi didn't rush into the spotlight. He kept a low profile and focused on rebuilding the organization from the ground up. One of his smartest moves was bringing in former officers from Saddam Hussein's army and intelligence services. These men had experience in planning operations, running security networks, and organizing large groups of fighters. They turned ISI into something more disciplined and more structured than it had ever been before. Then, in 2011, a major opportunity appeared: the civil war in Syria. What started as protests against President Bashar al-Assad quickly turned into a full-scale war. The country broke into different zones controlled by the government, rebel groups, and various militias. Borders became weak, and large areas had no real authority. Baghdadi saw exactly what Zarqawi had seen years earlier in Iraq: a power vacuum. By 2012 and 2013, ISI began sending fighters into Syria and building a presence there. Eventually, Baghdadi announced that his group would now be called the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. This move created tension with al-Qaeda's central leadership, especially Ayman al-Zawahiri, who opposed the expansion. But Baghdadi ignored him and continued pushing forward, effectively breaking away from al-Qaeda. Now, ISIS was no longer just an Iraqi insurgent group hiding in the shadows. It controlled territory on both sides of the Iraq-Syria border. It had experienced military planners, steady funding through extortion and smuggling, and a growing number of fighters. Attacks started increasing again in Iraq around 2012 and 2013, including large-scale prison breaks that freed hundreds of experienced militants. The year 2014 is when ISIS went from being a dangerous regional group to a global shock. In early June, they launched a massive offensive across northern Iraq, targeting key cities with speed and coordination that caught everyone off guard. Their fighters moved quickly, using a mix of surprise attacks, intimidation, and local support in some Sunni areas that felt neglected by the Iraqi government. Then came the moment that changed everything: the fall of Mosul on June 10, 2014. The Iraqi army had tens of thousands of troops stationed in and around the city, along with heavy weapons and armored vehicles. But when ISIS attacked, many units collapsed almost immediately. Soldiers abandoned their positions, left behind their uniforms, and fled. Some commanders disappeared without giving orders. Within just a few days, ISIS had taken full control of a city with more than 1 million people. What they gained from Mosul was massive. Banks were looted, reportedly giving them hundreds of millions of dollars in cash. Military bases were emptied, and ISIS captured US-made Humvees, tanks, artillery, and large stockpiles of weapons and ammunition. This suddenly transformed them into one of the richest and best-armed extremist groups the world had ever seen. Just days later, another shocking event took place near Tikrit. Hundreds of captured Iraqi soldiers, many of them unarmed cadets from Camp Speicher, were executed. Estimates suggest around 1,700 were killed. Then on June 29, 2014, Baghdadi made his boldest move. From the Great Mosque of Al-Nuri in Mosul, he declared the establishment of a caliphate and announced himself as the caliph. It was a claim to religious authority over Muslims worldwide. Most Muslim scholars and communities rejected this immediately, calling it illegitimate. But that didn't matter to ISIS. For many young men watching from around the world, this looked like something powerful. A group had not only survived years of war, but had created its own state, controlled cities, and challenged entire governments. Their propaganda pushed this image hard, showing strength, unity, and purpose. Foreign fighters started arriving in larger numbers than ever before. By some estimates, over 40,000 people from more than 100 countries would eventually travel to join ISIS. The group didn't just rely on military victories. They built a system where fear itself became their strongest weapon, and they used modern technology in a way no group had done before. Their media operations were highly organized. Groups like Al-Furqan Media and Al-Khayat Media Center produced videos that looked more like movie trailers than typical propaganda. They were designed to shock, to scare, and to spread quickly online. One of the most well-known moments came in August 2014 with the execution of James Foley, an American journalist who'd been kidnapped in Syria in 2012. The video showed a masked man, later identified as Mohammed Emwazi, often called Jihadi John, standing beside Foley. The setting was controlled, the message was clear, and the video was distributed globally within hours. This pattern continued with other hostages, including Steven Sotloff, David Haynes, and Alan Henning. Each video followed a similar structure, making it instantly recognizable and widely shared. At its peak between 2014 and 2015, ISIS controlled large parts of Iraq and Syria, including major cities like Mosul and Raqqa. This meant millions of people were living under their rule, and daily life became something completely different from anything they'd known before. ISIS created its own system of government. They had departments for security, education, health, and even taxation. But everything was controlled under strict and extreme interpretations of their ideology. They enforced rules through a religious police force, known as the Hisbah, which patrolled streets and checked people's behavior. Men were required to attend prayers. Smoking was banned. Music was banned. Even small violations could lead to severe punishment. Public executions became a regular part of life. These were often carried out in city squares, so that as many people as possible would see them. People accused of spying, resisting, or breaking rules were executed in front of crowds. Sometimes bodies were left displayed as a warning. Women faced heavy restrictions. They were required to wear full coverings and were not allowed to move freely without permission in many cases. Girls' education was limited or stopped entirely in some areas. At the same time, ISIS created all-female enforcement units like the Al-Qansa Brigade to monitor other women and enforce rules. Minorities suffered the worst treatment. And one of the most tragic examples was what happened to the Yazidis. In August 2014, ISIS launched an attack on the Sinjar region, where many Yazidis lived. Thousands of men were separated and killed, often in mass executions. Women and children were taken captive. Many of them were sold in markets as slaves, with documents issued by ISIS explaining how they could be bought, sold, or owned. Entire families were torn apart. Some Yazidi women were passed between fighters multiple times. children were taken and trained as fighters, often referred to as cubs of the caliphate. These children were exposed to violence at a very young age and trained to become the next generation. Despite all this, ISIS tried to maintain the appearance of normal life. They ran bakeries, collected taxes, and kept basic services running in some areas. But everything existed under constant fear. People followed rules not because they agreed with them, but because the consequences of breaking them were too severe. By 2015, ISIS had turned from a regional force into a global threat. What made this shift so dangerous was that they didn't just rely on fighters traveling to the Middle East anymore. They actively encouraged attacks in other countries, either by directing them through networks or inspiring individuals who had never even set foot in Iraq or Syria. One of the most shocking moments came in November 2015 in Paris. On the night of November 13th, a group of attackers carried out coordinated assaults across the city. They targeted restaurants, cafes, the Stade de France Stadium, and the Bataclan Concert Hall. The attackers used guns and suicide vests, moving from one location to another with clear planning and coordination. By the end of the night, 130 people were dead and hundreds more injured. It was one of the deadliest attacks in France's modern history. Investigations later showed that many of the attackers had connections to ISIS networks in Europe and Syria. Some had traveled to Syria and returned, while others were guided remotely. This showed that ISIS had built a system that could plan and support attacks far beyond its territory. Then in March 2016, another major attack took place in Brussels. Suicide bombers targeted the airport and a metro station, killing 32 people. Once again, links were found between the attackers and the same network connected to the Paris attacks. These weren't isolated incidents. These were part of a wider pattern. But what made things even more worrying was the rise of so-called lone wolf attacks. These were individuals who acted on their own, but claimed loyalty to ISIS. Some used vehicles to run over crowds. Others used knives or simple weapons. In July 2016, a man drove a truck into a crowd in Nice, France, killing 86 people during Bastille Day celebrations. He had no direct contact with ISIS leadership, but he had consumed their propaganda and acted in their name. This was the real shift. ISIS had created an idea that could travel without borders. They didn't need to train every attacker or fund every operation. All they needed was to influence people through videos, messages, and online posts. They gave simple instructions and encouraged supporters to act wherever they were. For governments and security forces, this created a huge problem. You can track organized groups, but it's much harder to predict when a single individual will suddenly decide to act. The threat became unpredictable, and that uncertainty created fear far beyond the actual number of attacks. By late 2016, the situation had reached a point where a large international coalition decided that ISIS had to be pushed back completely. This coalition included the United States, European countries, and local forces in Iraq and Syria. The biggest target was Mosul, the same city that ISIS had captured so quickly in 2014. This time, taking it back wouldn't be easy. The battle began in October 2016 and lasted until July 2017. Iraqi forces, Kurdish fighters, and coalition air support all took part in the operation. ISIS had prepared for this moment. They built tunnels, planted thousands of roadside bombs, and turned entire neighborhoods into defensive positions. Fighting in Mosul was slow and extremely intense. Soldiers had to move street by street, building by building. ISIS fighters often hid among civilians, using them as shields to slow down the advance. Snipers were placed on rooftops. Explosives were hidden in cars, homes, and even children's toys. Drones were used by ISIS to drop small bombs from the air. It turned the city into a deadly maze. By the time Mosul was fully retaken in July 2017, large parts of the city were destroyed. Thousands of civilians had been killed, and many more were displaced. It was a victory, but one that came at a heavy cost. At the same time, another major battle was happening in Syria, the fight for Raqqa, which ISIS had used as its main headquarters. The Syrian Democratic Forces, supported by the United States, launched their operation in mid-2017. Just like Mosul, the battle was slow and destructive. ISIS resisted until the very end, using similar tactics of booby traps, tunnels, and human shields. By October 2017, Raqqa fell. This was a major turning point. ISIS had now lost its most important cities. The territory they once controlled had shrunk dramatically. The caliphate that had been declared with so much confidence in 2014 was collapsing piece by piece. By 2019, ISIS had lost almost all the territory it once controlled. The final stronghold in Baghouz, eastern Syria, fell in March 2019. But one key figure was still alive, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. He had not been seen publicly for years, and many rumors had spread about his condition. But he was still considered the leader of the group. In October 2019, U.S. intelligence located Baghdadi in a compound in northwestern Syria, near the village of Barishi in Idlib province. This area was far from ISIS's former strongholds, showing how much the group had been pushed back. On the night of October 26-27, U.S. Special Forces carried out a raid on the compound. As the forces approached, Baghdadi fled into a tunnel with some of his children. According to reports from the operation, he was cornered with no way out. Instead of surrendering, he detonated a suicide vest, killing himself and the children with him. The tunnel collapsed and the operation ended with his death being confirmed through DNA testing. For many around the world, this felt like the final chapter. The man who had declared the caliphate in 2014 was gone. The territory was gone. The group had been heavily damaged. But the reality was far more complicated. ISIS quickly announced a new leader, Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qureshi, showing that the organization still had a command structure. More importantly, ISIS had already adapted. It had gone back to operating in small cells, carrying out hit-and-run attacks, bombings, and assassinations in parts of Iraq and Syria. Without a central territory, they just became harder to track. So even though Baghdadi's death was a major moment, it didn't erase what ISIS had built over the years.